Hi there, my name's Simon King and I'm the author of the Sam Rader thriller series. Book 5 is due out very soon and it's called Thrill Kill, and I wanted to do something a little bit different today. It's Saturday afternoon, always trusty laptop in hand, and I just wanted to take a quick break from my normal writing just to say hello and maybe offer you something a little bit different. How about I read the first chapter to you, the first chapter of Thrill Kill? I've never done this type of thing before, so it's a bit of a spur of the moment decision, and I hope you enjoy it. So here we go. Chapter 1 of Thrill Kill. Jill checked her reflection in the mirror for a third time in as many minutes. She quietly scoffed at herself, wondering again how she could have allowed herself to be talked into wearing such a degrading outfit. But slutty nurse or not, she was the freshman, and following through with her initiation pledge is not something she was about to renege on. After a final look at herself, she took a deep breath, grabbed a handbag, and turned for the door. The air was cool for September, and her skin instantly grew goosebumps the moment Jill stepped out from her dorm. Despite it being a Saturday night, there were far fewer people walking around than she was used to. All at parties, she thought to herself, flashing a passing girl a brief smile. The place she was supposed to go to was the old machine shop, the building located out near the abandoned wing of the campus. The heels she had chosen to complement her outfit were not what she would usually wear for such a hike, but given the importance of the night, figured the extra effort would be appreciated by the other attendees. While the other freshmen chosen for this little initiation party were all given varying outfits, she wondered whether they were all as revealing as hers. She had worked hard to maintain her figure over the summer, and agreeing to wear it had only been for the sake of Jake, the guy who'd caught her eye that first day. She needed to show him just how fantastic she looked, and the nurse's outfit would serve that purpose perfectly. As she continued to head along the mostly deserted path, her mind kept returning to Wanda, the girl who had allocated the outfits for the freshmen to wear. She had spoken to Wanda only a few times over the course of the previous couple of weeks, and each time noted how insincere she became whenever Jill was near. Did she feel threatened by her? Jill hadn't heard anything about anyone taking a disliking to her, but perhaps someone had noticed the way she looked at Jake. Would they tell her if she did? She didn't know, was about to scold herself for thinking silly thoughts, but instead felt her ankle give way as a heel collapsed beneath her. "Fuck," she hissed, grabbing the handrail just in time to prevent a face planting. Slowly sitting down on the concrete path, Jill reached for her throbbing ankle and gave it a rub. A twisted ankle was not something new to her, having endured weak ankles since a horse riding accident years before. She slipped off the first shoe, then the other, staring at the remains of her $99 specials. "You okay?" a passing couple asked, and Jill nodded. Opting to go barefoot the rest of the way, Jill carefully rose to her feet again, the pain continuing to throb as she took a small step forward. While the path continued on all the way to the old part of the campus, the streetlights did not, and what crossed her mind at that moment was broken glass. What if some idiot had decided to smash a few bottles after finishing them earlier in the evening? Jill looked back over her shoulder and considered returning to her room, changing her shoes over and then hurrying back. But seeing the street disappear round a bend and not wanting to second-guess herself, she decided to push on. She looked ahead to where the last of the streetlights illuminated the path before it disappeared into the darkness, and reminded herself that Jake would be waiting for her at the end of it. Jake, with the boyish good looks and a smile that could melt ice with its warmth. She continued on, and a few minutes later passed the last of the streetlights. The old building waited just a couple of 100 yards further along the path, with the old machine shop located on the far side. If she hurried, this degrading moment would be over sooner rather than later. The full moon broke free from the clouds just as Jill reached the side of the machine shop, the door guarded by Bruce Tanner, the over-enthusiastic swim champ. He spoke with a lisp that had made her giggle since their first meeting, but now standing before him in a personal nightmare, giggling was the furthest thing from her mind. "Jill, glad you could make it," he cooed, eyeing her up and down. "And I love the bare feet. Hot," he added, shaking his fingers up and down to signify his appreciation. For the first time since leaving her room, Jill appreciated the dark as she felt a blush heat her cheeks. "Anybody else here yet?" she asked. "Almost everybody," Bruce whispered, held the door open, and waved her inside. Few of the original classroom pieces remained, with just a few relics scattered here and there. Most of the windows that lined the top half of one wall were either boarded up or broken, and the moon illuminated the dozen or so people waiting for her. Jill sheepishly walked into the centre of them, unable to make out any of their faces. But when one of them stepped forward and began to speak, it was Wanda she could see hiding behind her black mask. "Glad you could make it, Jiz," Wanda whispered menacingly, someone else giggling much to her delight. "We have just the thing for you." "It's Jill," Jill offered, instantly angry at how frightened she sounded, even to herself. I prefer Jiz." She stepped forward as if to elevate her assertion further. "Where are the others?" Jill asked, suddenly feeling very alone. "The others?" Wanda took another step forward. "Oh, the others are around. Didn't think we'd have all of you together, did you?" She held up something that swung from her hand, dangling from side to side in the shadows. "No, this part of your journey is taken alone," Wanda continued, and it wasn't until someone snapped on a torch that Jill could make out the object swinging before her. It was a set of leather cuffs, the kind used in domination games. She recognised them because her friend Audrey had used a pair on her boyfriend and always left them hanging from her bedpost. "What are you going to do?" Jill asked, the uneasy feeling continuing to intensify. "We're just going to have a bit of fun, that's all." Jill took a look at each of the faces watching her, the masks hiding all but the eyes. She thought back to when she had first been handed the outfit and the faces watching her then to see if she would accept the dare. It was those same eyes that now spoke volumes about what she was about to endure, and wanting things over quickly, she reluctantly stepped forward and held her wrists out. Wanda began to giggle almost immediately. "Oh, I don't think so, Jiz. This isn't that type of game." Wanda turned and nodded to the two people standing to her right, and they immediately stepped forward. Just before they picked her up, Wanda leaned in a little closer and whispered, "These are for your ankles, sweetheart." Jill felt herself pulled sideways, then lifted by the two shadows, one supporting her back, while the other held her beneath the knees. Sticking to her role as lead antagonist, Wanda stepped forward, swinging the shackles a final time. "Let's play," she whispered, as the restraints were tied around Jill's ankles, the leather straps more than ample to fit her tiny stature. Once tied, the two people holding her began to shuffle somewhere further into the room. Jill tried to look where, but before she could, a hood was suddenly pulled over her head. "What are you going to do?" Jill asked, her tone finally revealing the real fear she was feeling. "We're just going to give you a little swing. You know, dangle you from the ceiling for a bit." This time the voice sounded male, but not one Jill recognised. She squeezed her eyes shut and did her best to pretend she was in fact in a lit room, with the sun streaming in through the broken windows. Imagining daylight had always worked whenever she felt afraid of the dark. A loud ratcheting suddenly broke through the darkness. effortlessly overpowering the voices around her. The arms holding her remained steady for a moment longer, until Jill felt her feet suddenly begin to rise as the clamps bit into her supple skin. Trying her best to remain strong, the bound girl simply bit her lip and focused all her attention on that pain instead. Slowly the cable continued to lift her feet into the air, until the second set of arms carefully lowered her upper half, and Jill felt herself completely suspended upside down. It was only when the ratcheting finally stopped that the snickering resumed, while Jill waited for the final bit of humiliation to reveal itself. Bright lights suddenly snapped on, and Jill could make out vague shapes through the hood. When someone finally pulled it free, she could see it was nothing more than a pillowcase. For a brief moment her eyes winced in pain from the brightness as the spotlights illuminated the suspended prisoner. As if to add to her humiliation, Wanda stepped forward with a second set of cuffs and tied the girl's hands behind her back, before joining the two restraints with a third cable, effectively ending any chance for escape. For the final humiliating act, Wanda pulled a gag ball from her pocket, spun it around her finger, and pushed it into Jill's mouth, before tying the loose ends behind her neck. "Ready for the main event?" Wanda whispered into Jill's ear, and then, leaning closer still, added, "Don't you ever eye my man off again, bitch." Jill stared back wide-eyed, noticing the torment in her captor's eyes for the first time. No, not just torment, but outright hatred. Wanda looked upon Jill with promised vendetta against her captive, and seeing the fear build in her victim's eyes only fed her resolve. With a flick of her fingers, Wanda called forth her followers, and Jill saw each grab markers from their pockets. "Sluts need to be labelled, don't you think?" Wanda asked as she began to write on Jill's brilliantly white outfit. The others followed suit, covering the uniform with words like slut, whore, bitch, and more. Not satisfied with writing on the dress alone, Wanda began to use the marker on Jill's arms and legs, the girl powerless to resist. Jill tried to scream, but the ball gag did its job well. With a little more than a loud groan to highlight her resistance, she had no choice but to wait for the group to finish. It was only when they stood back and began snapping photos with their cell phones that Jill really tried to fight herself free. But no matter how hard she struggled against her restraints, they held strong. Excuse me. Just as Jill thought they had finished playing their game, Wanda stepped forward again, and this time directed Jill's attention beneath her, to the point she was suspended over. Sitting directly beneath her sat a small gas bottle, an outdoor heating element affixed to the top. "Know how hot those things burn, bitch?" Wanda asked, and Jill looked at her horrified. 1,000 thoughts ran through her mind, and again she struggled against her restraints. "Let's find out." One of the others stepped forward and pulled Jill aside, while another lit the burner. The match sparked the heating element with a soft swoosh, and Jill froze as she considered her fate. As she watched the flame turn the heater bright red, Wanda turned back to her and smiled. "This is to remind you who Jake belongs to." The one holding her to the side suddenly let go, and Jill swung down and across the top of the heater, skating above the element itself by almost 18 inches. She was still low enough to feel the heat, and with each swing felt the panic bite deeper into her. Tears began to run from her eyes, and on one pass, thought she heard one fall and sizzle on the glowing metal. "Brrr," Jill gargled, refusing to form. Words refusing to form. The terror peaked inside her, and as she continued to swing to the chorus of cheers from her tormentors, wondered whether the nightmare would ever end. They circled her at one point, and as Jill reached the apex of each swing, would be pushed hard in the opposite direction, like a gagged pendulum. She kept her eyes squeezed tight to block out as much as she could, doing her best to get through the torture. After what felt like an eternity, Wanda finally called for the fire to be extinguished. But just as Jill thought she would finally be released from her ordeal, her tormentor conveyed other plans. Whack the hood back on her and let her hang for a bit. I'm sure she needs time to think. Before Jill could react, the pillowcase was pulled over her head for a second time, and a few seconds later, she heard the unmistakable snap of lights being switched off. Later, loser, Wanda mocked, her voice sounding further away. Hope you're not afraid of the dark. Jill froze, feeling the pressure of her heart pulsating in her very eyes. She tried to listen for any sign of her tormentors, but the longer she hung from her shackles, the more she realized she was alone, tied and suspended in a place she could barely comprehend. Panic enveloped her, and Jill could do no more than to hang there and let them ravage her thoughts. She was completely helpless, a virtual slave, with no earthly control over herself. As the minutes turned to hours, her thoughts began to turn to questions, like how long a person could survive suspended, or whether the local wildlife would come to feed on her. Before long, her eyes began to feel heavy, and although she could never have imagined it possible, eventually fell asleep. Bang! Was it them returning? Jill was sure she heard the door open, the sound rousing her from a very shallow sleep. She remembered the sound of the rusted hinges protesting just loud enough for her to hear when Bruce had opened the door for her. Had that been what had awoken her? Jill tried to sense where the door should be and turned her head in that direction. When she thought she had it right, she tried to speak, temporarily forgetting about the gag still assaulting her mouth like one of those weird aliens she had seen in a movie. She froze, another sound reaching out to her from the dark, this one sounding much closer. The beating in her chest began to pick up again as the adrenaline kicked in. Jill tried to reach out with her senses, helplessly trapped by her restraints. There! Another sound. Were they footsteps? Furbrr, she tried to call, felt drool run up her face and paused again, trying to listen for whatever had now joined her. A thought suddenly sprang forth, and it sent a fresh dump of adrenaline through her veins. What if it was a wolf? Or a bear? And then, as if an afterthought, do they even have bears in Texas? She wasn't sure, and given the light-footedness of whatever was in the room with her, doubted it to be an animal. As she tried to hang as still as possible, the pressure in her bladder finally came forward, and she had a moment of panic as she realised if no help came, and the need to pee became too great, her urine only had a single direction to fall. Realising that even gravity was about to betray her, Jill fought her shackles again, shaking herself relentlessly until the leather straps beat deep into her flesh. It was the sound of the ratcheting that suddenly filled her world, followed by the sensation of herself being slowly lowered. Had her saviour arrived? Was it Jake? She prepared to feel the sensation of the ground meeting her face as she continued listening to that awful ratcheting, the sound now a lot sweeter than she first imagined. It seemed to continue on, and for a brief moment she wondered just how high she had been strung up. Surely the ground would meet her soon. But before she felt the floor meet her, the ratcheting stopped, and footsteps slowly came towards her. They sounded like boots on the concrete floor, and Jill thought about campus security, or possibly even the sheriff. A hand suddenly touched her, and Jill shrieked, caught off guard. It touched her arm and simply held her for a brief moment before moving up to her shoulder. Panic gripped her further as thoughts of a rapist finding her burst through. She certainly had the invitation written all over her. As she began to wonder whether the pervert was going to have his way with her, the pillowcase was suddenly pulled from her face. but the person helping was standing behind her, and all Jill could make out were the shadows of the room, the remaining relics barely visible in the dim moonlight. Jill tried, but the sound was more like a drill-filled gibberish. The person suddenly pulled her sideways, much like her previous tormentors had, as they prepared to swing her from side to side. This time she was pulled much higher, the strength of the person powerful enough to pull her almost back to upright. She felt herself turn just enough to see a face, barely 6 inches from her own, cold eyes staring out from the darkness. The person let go of his grip, and Jill felt herself swing hard towards the other side, feeling like an abused pendulum again. But just as she dropped back again, she felt something on her way through, something that reminded her of the previous game the others had played. She felt heat as she swung above the camp heater, her saviour having fired the flame up again. Jill tried to turn as she swung back and forth, trying to see the face of the person watching her, but the heat, now turned to maximum, took her breath away with each pass, and she tried her best to lift herself as high as she could. The man, of that fact she was sure, continued to watch her, and Jill had the slightest inclination that he was grinning. She wasn't positive, but each time she reached the full swing's arc, her motion temporarily paused long enough for her to look at this new person. It was a man, and for a split second thought she recognized him. Of that she was sure. But as she continued to swing, Jill suddenly realized that her momentum was slowing with each pass, bringing her even closer to the center of gravity and the point where she would be suspended directly above the heating element. The man continued to watch. She stared down as she passed the flame, feeling the heat bite more and more with each swing. A minute or so after starting this latest ordeal, her arcs had reduced considerably, and Jill began to struggle against her bonds in earnest. The leather straps were now tearing into her, with thin trails of blood running down her legs. The heat continued to rise, and with barely 3 or 4 inches between her and the element, felt her hair begin to singe. She screamed again, begging for the grinning apparition to help her, and the man continued to watch. In the final few seconds before her momentum came to a complete halt, Jill could see him grinning at her, the colour of the flame reflected in his drooling teeth. Jill fought to keep her body upright for as long as possible, trying to scream against the gag in her mouth. She'd always had amazing abs, and they now did their best to hold her away from the roaring broiler waiting directly beneath. But whatever strength she did have quickly ran out, and as she felt the urine finally let go from above, wondered why the scent of her flesh burning smelt so familiar. Her screams reached their apex and were quickly silenced as the hair on her head finally erupted into a fireball, and the man continued to watch. And there you have it, Chapter 1 of Thrill Kill. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed writing it, and I really can't wait for you to read the rest of the book. Alright, so from me, have a wonderful weekend, and I hope to talk to you soon. Thank you.